In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about the different circuits in the brain.
So Jack Panksepp actually, who wrote a great book called Affective Neuroscience, by the way. If any of you are interested in like the psychobiology of behavior and motivation, Jack Panksepp's book is one of the best. I don't have a paper by him in our collection, but he's a very smart guy. He wrote this book called Affective Neuroscience, and it's actually, given its title and the relative complexity of its thoughts, it's actually quite readable, even though it's a text. It's a little more personal than your typical text might be. And Panksepp is also very interested in psychodynamic and personality ideas, so he's a very broad thinker. And so if you're interested in an approach to psychology that sort of crosses the threshold from personality into emotion and biology, Panksepp, as well as Gray, there's a Gray paper that you're reading, Panksepp's a very, very good source. He discovered the play circuit, for example, and he also discovered that rats laugh. So if you tickle a rat, it laughs. You can't hear it though, because it laughs ultrasonically like a bat. But if you record the rat giggling and then slow down the tape, then you can tell that the rat laughs. And rats need to play, and most mammals need to play in order to socialize them. So one of the things, you can think about this when you're parents too, and this is probably especially relevant for the men, because one of the things you might ask is, what role do men play in the socialization of children? And one thing that men really do seem to do with kids is to engage in rough and tumble play, especially once they're a little older than 2, say 2 to 5 or something. And kids love that. They absolutely love rough and tumble play. Gets them so excited that, they get out of control fundamentally. But rough and tumble play is an excellent mode of socialization, because it teaches the child the distinction between aggression and too much aggression, right? Because if you're wrestling with a kid, the kid has to keep their behavioral output under a fair degree of control to keep the game going, to make it rough enough to be exciting, but not so rough that they get hurt, or that they stick their thumb in their dad's eye or something like that. And you can think of that from a Piagetian sense too, because it's a game. But imagine that if you're trying to figure out how to configure yourself around other people, if you haven't had that rough and tumble play, you don't really know where the boundaries of your body are, and you don't know how much you can take and how much you can be stretched and how much you can be thrown around, and when something actually hurts rather than is frightening. And so all of that intense sort of play that boys in particular are likely to engage in, although girls also like it, seems to be very useful for teaching children about how to engage with the world and with other people in a physical way, and that's one of the physiological foundations for higher order socialization. So it's very useful. I mean, I've often noted that children who haven't had the opportunity to engage in physical play, they're kind of awkward. They're not seated well in their body, and it's like they're kind of vague physically. Whereas the ones who've been twisted around and bent and thrown up in the air and wrestled in general, they're a lot more conscious of their limits and their abilities in their body, and they're also much more able to invite other kids to play. You can think about this with regards to dogs. If you have a dog, the dog, you can tell when the dog wants to play, right? What does the dog do? Yeah, it jumps around, and it puts its rear end in the air often, and its head down, and it looks up, which is a little bit submissive and a little bit friendly, and it wags its tail, and it might bark, and it moves back and forth. And like little kids that want to play they don't put their tails in the air, obviously, but they engage in like play invitation behaviors like that, a little bit of teasing sometimes, and they're trying to get some play initiated. It's also practice for later dominance. When chimps play, the males in particular, as they approach adolescence, the play behavior, because they'll throw sticks at the old chimps who are laying down and sleeping, or come up and poke them, or tease them. And then as they become more and more powerful and more adolescent, say into adulthood, then that play will become full-blown dominance challenges, as you no doubt noticed if you were in junior high school, because that's exactly what happens to teachers, right? The little elementary school kids, they're kind of cute. When they misbehave, they're sort of playful, but by the time grade 8 or grade 9 comes around, the pushing on the teacher is a lot harder. And so you can see how play shades into dominance dispute But it is a separate circuit. Exploration, that's a separate circuit. And one of the things that we'll talk about today is Swanson's elaboration of the fact that half of the hypothalamus is fundamentally devoted towards exploration, which is quite cool. It means exploration is a really, really, really old system. And it's sort of like, if you haven't got anything else to do, so you don't want to play, you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not angry, you're not too warm or too cold, etc., etc., your default isn't sort of quiescent sleep, right? You don't just run out of batteries and lie on the floor, unless you're, of course, obviously, unless you're very tired. What'll generally happen is if the other fundamental motivational states have been satiated, then you'll engage in exploration, and different people at different rates. If you're extroverted, you'll engage in exploration in the social environment, and if you're open, then you'll engage in exploration at a more cognitive level. So that would be with regards to artistic creativity or to fiction or the expression of some sort of intellectual or philosophical pursuit. And the reason that you're wired up that way is because if you have a little extra energy, you might as well use that to map out more of the environment so that when push comes to shove somewhere down the road, you'll be in possession of more information and more flexible and more knowledgeable in your conceptual and perceptual structures, and also in your actions. So people have a pretty strong tendency to default to exploration, but there's variability in that. You can also sort of divide up these motivations as ingestive or defensive. That's not a bad way of looking at it. And then there's reproductive motivations as well. That's unlikely to be a full map. It kind of depends on where you put the emotions, because we know, for example, that there's a separate disgust circuit, and that doesn't seem to load with anxiety or with pain. It's its own biological system, and it seems to be associated with trait conscientiousness, maybe, and also with political conservatism and orderliness. So those things are all quite interesting. They all kind of clump together, but whether that's an emotion or a motivation's not exactly clear, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. So there's the hypothalamus, and as you can see, it's not one thing. Of course, nothing at the macro level in the brain is one thing, obviously. It's this layered thing, just like everything else in the world, except even more so, because the brain is so incredibly complicated. And you can see by looking at that, there's all the things that are colored there, basically hypothalamic modules, I guess would be a reasonable way of putting it. And you can tell they're even anatomically distinct, so obviously they're not doing exactly the same thing. So you might think of brain anatomy as sort of a fixed, what would you call, something that we've already managed quite well, and we have all the category systems down, and the structure of the brain's quite well known, and that's really not true at all. Like, the brain is truly terra incognita, and it isn't even, like, our naming rituals, let's say, or conventions are not necessarily appropriate for one-to-one mapping of, say, structure onto function. So they're sort of anatomical. They're markers for anatomical convenience in some ways.